If you're a fan of Iron Maiden, I think you're going to enjoy this video. You know, what we do a lot on this channel is we go to old newspapers and we look for record reviews, concert reviews, things like that, and kind of find out what people were saying back when these things were first coming out. Sometimes what I do is I try to find articles then that talk to people that we wouldn't hear from all the time. So for example, in this one, what I was doing is looking for something to see if I can find an interview with Adrian Smith. You know, it's very common to see articles where you have interviews with Bruce Dickinson and Steve Harris, but then it's kind of interesting for me to see what can I find with the people that weren't necessarily the ones that all the the reporters were trying to talk to. And so I found this one, and it talks to Adrian Smith a little bit, and I just thought it was kind of interesting, and I thought you'd find this interesting too. So this is from the Arizona Daily Star, July 7th, 1983. So to put this in perspective, and if you're looking on the screen, you can see this. This is when Peace of Mind was out. Now, Peace of Mind came out in May 16th of 1983. And so this is just less than 2 months later when this article came out. And the article is called, "It's a Matter of Taste with Iron Maiden. Eddie's a barrel of laughs. Sometimes the gaunt little fellow can be espied wielding a bloody axe, smiling away at some desperate sot. Sometimes Eddie's cavorting with the devil, playing with fire, his eye sockets blazing with flames. Most recently, Ed, his whitish hair, shaved down to a skull that had been sawed in half and then clamped back together, was hanging round a padded cell/coffin, restrained by chains and straitjacket. Yeehaw, huh?" I remember when when this album first came out, and I saw that cover. I mean, it was so crazy. You know, that picture of Eddie in the padded room with his head. Anyway, it was so cool. You may not think so, but according to Iron Maiden, the British band that created Eddie as its mascot, Eddie is one big laugh. And Iron Maiden, which takes its name from a medieval instrument of torture, ought to know. And this is pretty interesting too, because if you were paying attention at the time and you were a kid listening to this stuff, boy, these album covers and the Eddie character, I mean, he was the epitome of evil. And these guys, it really was kind of fun, you know, and it was kind of horror film kind of stuff. And it really was. And looking back on it, you can kind of see that now. Eddie, oh yeah, he's just larger than life, explained Adrian Smith, one of Iron Maiden's two guitarists. He's just like a horror magazine thing. I hope people would see the humor in it. You've got to take it with a bit of humor, unquote. The fact, according to Smith, most all of the heavy metal music Iron Maiden has made since its first album in 1980 is funny. You've just got to laugh at songs like Killers, Murders in the Rue Morgue, Wrathchild, Children of the Damned, and Gangland, right? You can laugh until your ears bleed when Iron Maiden, Saxon, and Fastway play at the Tucson Community Center area Monday. Since Maiden is bringing twice as much sound equipment to America as it uses elsewhere, you may not be doing too much laughing before the bleeding starts. And by the way, if you saw Iron Maiden on this tour, I'd love to hear about that, because they had Saxon and Fastway opening up for them. And I loved Fastway. They were so cool. That first album, when that came out, I mean, man, I think we have another video on this channel about that. I loved that stuff. Although Smith says the band is just after a good time on vinyl, on stage and backstage, it does seem to dwell on violence and death. But the subject matter is the only logical choice, really, for a heavy metal band of Iron Maiden's stature and decibel level. Quote, "Once you play this sort of music, heavy metal, it's hard to write about life on the road and love you baby lyrics because the music is hard and fast." Now that's actually a really funny comment, because when you put this in perspective of 1983, that was true, but when you watch the evolution of heavy metal through the 80s, it really got away from that. Now, Iron Maiden stuck to this, and some other bands did, of course, but you watched heavy metal turn back into kind of the glam world of the early 70s, and then all they sang about was life on the road and girls, and I mean, and so it all evolved away from this. It was just kind of fascinating to watch. "We're not violent people, though," Smith said reassuringly. Well, people do begin to suspect them because of songs like The Number of the Beast, with its talk of 666 and hell, and because of terrifying Oops, Sorry, Funny album covers. People begin to suspect that all this outrageousness is done simply for shock value, publicity even. People also begin to cry devil worship. As singer Bruce Air Raid Siren Dickinson said in another interview, quote, "That song is basically a sort of warning, a dream. I don't think that people over here, America, listen to the lyrics. That's really been a misunderstanding," unquote. On the subsequent album, they included a lyric sheet. Smith, who writes the music for the songs, thinks the lyrics aren't that important anyway. Now, this is interesting because Adrian Smith didn't really start writing songs until Number of the Beast. And he didn't write that many, wasn't really involved. Because as you know, if you're an Iron Maiden fan, Steve Harris writes almost everything, almost all their songs. And Adrian Smith, it just puts it there, Smith who writes music for the songs. He really, when the songs that he wrote, 22 Acacia Avenue, he was part of that one. Flight of Icarus, which is off of this album, and started getting some, actually, I think even got some radio play a little bit at the time. He was involved in writing The Prisoner, Die With Your Boots On. And I know he's written things since then, but from when you go back and look at this period, those are some of the songs that he'd been involved with. So he really, he was influential a little bit in some of the songwriting, but it's just interesting to have that here. Smith, who writes the music for the songs, yeah, he'd written some music for some of the songs. Thinks the lyrics aren't that important anyway. Quote, "Our lyrics aren't message lyrics. They're really secondary to the music. Then again, people can read whatever they want into them," unquote. And that's such an interesting statement. Because to be honest, I love the lyrics in Iron Maiden's music. I mean, you go back, they're so clever and they're so interesting. And again, like a song like 22 Acacia Avenue, the lyrics are just kind of awesome. I love them. Even The Number of the Beast, do with it what you will, you know, the storyline in the song itself, but it is a story. And it takes you on this little, it escalates and it takes you on this little adventure. And he talks about it as being a dream. That may be, but it is a storyline and it's cool. And Run to the Hills. I hate to bring up such a trite, obvious example, but those are great lyrics. I love the lyrics in their songs. So the fact that they say they're secondary, and that may be, but they did have, compared to so much of heavy metal that would come after this, where it really was just kind of tired singing about the stuff that heavy metal kind of became in the late 80s with so many bands, they really did have what I thought were exceptional, at least really good lyrics in those albums. Most heavy metal music shares with punk a rather bleak, fatalistic outlook, yet most devotees of each genre wouldn't venture into the other camp, although some do because, quote, they get off on the general noise, unquote. Smith thinks heavy metal is, quote, more humorous, more entertaining. And that's interesting also because there are a lot of people that will compare the early Iron Maiden stuff with Paul Di'Anno to the punk movement that was happening. I know they're not the same. I understand that, but the attitude that came from them, they shared some similar things. And you look at Paul Di'Anno, look at pictures of him in the early days, and and then look at pictures of the Sex Pistols. They're kind of interchangeable. The attitudes that came with them, there was something about that. There was something about the energy and the power. And even, you know, I'll tell you something, and I don't mean to get off on this, but when I was a young guy in the early 80s and I was really getting into heavy metal, one of my best friends was into punk rock, and we kind of liked each other's music. And so there really was something to that. Anyway, and I would really love to get your feedback on that too. If you grew up during this time, what was your experience with that, with this kind of overlap between punk rock and heavy metal that was going on in those early days? I've told this story before, but if you are familiar with Fast as a Shark, except that album, Restless and Wild, when I first heard that album, it was a friend of mine that was into punk rock. And he had that album and he played it for me and he loved it. And then I loved it. And then I was totally into Accept after that. So there really is something to that. And I'd love to get your feedback on this. Yet, looking at the lyrics to the Iron Maiden albums, they do seem pretty depressing. The depression continues on their latest album, Peace of Mind, the one in which Eddie's had his lobotomy, Peace of Mind, ha ha. Here, Iron Maiden turns from street and satanic violence to the more orchestrated violence of war. An overriding theme can be gleaned from songs like Where Eagles Dare, Die With Your Boots On, and The Trooper, which warns, you'll take my life, but I'll take yours too. You'll fire your musket, but I'll run you through. The idea is that if everything's going to come to nothing, you might as well have fun, or at least hubris. Another song is the cheery Still Life, which comes to the conclusion, all my life's blood is slowly draining away, and I feel that I'm weaker every day. Somehow I know I haven't long to go, joining them at the bottom of the pool. Still Life, I loved that tune. And that's the one that starts off with the backwards recording. Anyway, if you ever listen to it, you'll remember at the beginning of the song, there's that backwards speaking. Anyway, that's Still Life. I actually really, really loved that tune. I think perhaps it is depressing, but it's just our fantasies, Smith said. Do these fantasies prey on the minds of the band's young, mainly male audience? Do they incite violence? Do they, as one recent newspaper article suggested, foster teenage suicide? Quote, I think they'd have to be pretty unbalanced to begin with for this to push them over the edge, unquote, Smith mused. Smith said he'd let his kid listen to heavy metal if he wanted to, and thinks others get the same reaction from it that he and the rest of his mates do. Quote, we just let off a bit of steam, unquote. And that's the end of the article. And I think, I got to tell you, I think there's something to that. I mean, looking back at this, I still love this music, and I still listen to it. But when you're a kid, like I was in my early teens when this came out, there was something to the release of energy. And this is why when I get back to that whole thing of punk, because what did punk rock do? It was an attitude, and it was a similar thing. It was a release. And when you're, as it puts there, a young male that has that kind of aggression built up in you, there is something to listening to this music at that age that was just this release of energy that came with it. And you'd see that as heavy metal developed into the late 80s, early 90s, and you'd get into this stuff where you'd have the mosh pits and things, which was kind of, would take you back to the way people would, what was it called, slam dancing that would happen with the early punk era. There really was something to that. And it was great for a teenage kid in that era to have something like this that gave that to you. There was something to that. And today I just appreciate the music. It isn't that aggression, but there was something to that as a kid. And I'd love to get your feedback too. This music, how did it speak to you, and what did it do for you back in those early days? Was it similar to me, where it provided that kind of release for you as a young teenage kid, that these albums and this music just had that energy release for you? It's kind of an awesome thing. Anyway, if you don't follow this channel, please follow the channel and share this video with your friends. We'd love to get your comments on this, and please like the video as well. And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.